about Israel and its place in the Middle East. And who better to do that with than Devin Sper, author, Senior Fellow, Center for Advanced Middle East Studies. Are you concerned, Devin, are you unusually concerned about all of the latest diplomatic and non-diplomatic activities going on between this country, the United Nations, Europe in general, and Iran?
Well, it's funny you ask that, because it's particularly the diplomatic initiatives that worry me. I think the Iranians are dead set on obtaining nuclear weapons. They state that openly. And they're trying to give the West enough of a fig leaf by negotiating that they won't do anything about it.
Well, have they really said that we are going after nuclear weaponry? They have publicly.
I stand corrected.
We are a peace-loving nation.
Yes.
Except for you infidels. We are a peace-loving nation, and we want the same kind of technology to acquire power for our citizens.
You're quite right. They actually openly say that they're going after nuclear technology,
yes,
not nuclear weapons. But for a country which is the fourth largest exporter of oil in the world, that's transparent. They obviously do have a nuclear weapons program.
And they haven't got the best track record in the world from the standpoint of its relationships with other countries.
No, they demonstrate open hostility. In fact, I believe that the reason that they are interested in a nuclear weapon is that they aim to become the leader of the entire radical Islamic movement.
Part of that has been, in the past at least, elements of Pakistan. Yet Pakistan has nuclear weaponry, and we haven't really done a whole lot about that. India, on its border, has nuclear weapons. We haven't done a whole lot about that. They're supposed to be our friends when it's convenient. So how do we say to Iran, no, I'm terribly sorry, we're choosing you, you don't get to?
Well, that's a very good question. India is not a country which has an ideology seeking to destroy the rest of the world. India is a power, as is China, but they're not rogue regimes who openly espouse world domination, as do the radical Islamists who Iran supports. Pakistan did have that point of view at one time, but turned around immediately after 9/11, decided to ally themselves with us, at some risk to the Prime Minister, who's been, there have been a number of assassination attempts against him.
And at least in this country, you just get voted out of office, or you get bad press. There you get bombs in your car.
No, in that part of the world, it's a bullet or you're still in power.
So, if diplomacy continues, at least as an effort, do you think it will ever work? And if not, then what's the alternative?
First of all, the answer to the first question is no. It will not work in the case of Iran. I have to tell you, Pat, I'm not a big believer in diplomacy. I'm a student of history, and in my opinion, from the creation of the world until today, diplomacy has never achieved one positive thing. That's my opinion.
Did it not work with Gaddafi?
It was the threat of force that worked with Gaddafi.
Well, that's a form of diplomacy, isn't it?
That sort of diplomacy works, yes, I agree. But diplomacy, as the Europeans want to practice it, which is simply a fig leaf for inaction, that form of diplomacy will not work, certainly not with Iran. Iran's rejected the European initiative and the American initiative one day after it was introduced last week.
I've had Iranians here as guests and have talked to a number of them in conversation, either professionally or socially. And in every case, they continue to say this government really isn't representative of the people of Iran. The people of Iran, remarkably young demographically, by the way, for the comparison with the rest of the world, but a very, very young, somewhat westernized society, as they are allowed to be, who just simply don't do anything about the constraints politically because the army, the police, and the government are in charge.
That's absolutely true. I have no doubt that that's true. There are demonstrations recently and have been over the past few years at all the universities in Iran. I think it was just last week there were riots, but the Revolutionary Guard is very brutal. It's a sort of SA-type organization, and they simply beat up or annihilate anyone who opposes the regime.
So how long will it be before Israel says, I'll tell you what, guys, you folks in the UN and America and China, Russia, all of you folks now have made every effort in the world, and we're going to give Iran about 3 days.
I'm sorry to say, to be honest with you, that I don't believe Israel's going to do that.
They did.
When did they do that?
They did when they took out another nuclear installation in the past.
That was.
If I have to start reminding you about Israel, then Devin, we've got to get somebody else in here. That's all there is to it.
That was then. Israel today is a vastly different country.
Okay, how? How different?
That is the theme of my book, which is that Israel needs to go back to that sort of policy.
You mean this book?
The Future of Israel.
The one I'm holding up right now? The Future of Israel, available at all discriminating bookstores everywhere. And you're talking about the future of Israel, not very optimistically, I must say.
No, because I feel that this government is not the government that took out the nuclear reactor in Ostrich. Every day, Palestinians from Gaza are shelling and hitting Israeli cities with rockets. And the Israeli government is doing essentially nothing against that. If they were not willing to deal with a gang of thugs in Gaza, they're certainly not going to deal with the government of Iran.
Well, what would you have them do? He asks, knowing that he has a break coming up in a matter of seconds, hoping that the audience will say, wait a minute, I want to know the answer to that with Devin Sper. He has been very, very actively involved with Israel, their politics, their military, and we'll find out exactly what it is that you think that he's going to say, because he's going to say it on the Pat McMahon Show on AZTV. Stick around, you'll find out more about Israel and Iran and the rest of the Middle East in just a moment. Devin Sper is here. A little later on, we're going to be talking about sports. And then we're also going to be talking with a man who devoted much of his life to sports, the Los Angeles Rams. And now he's devoting his life to you and how it is that you can improve yourself. Who says so? Johnny Johnson. Who says that Israel is getting short with patience? Devin Sper. But you say that they're probably also not equipped to do anything about it. You think they're kind of wussy now?
Not equipped is not correct. They are absolutely equipped. They can deal with the Palestinians in 24 hours. The problem is a question of will. And I feel, yes, that they don't have the national will, the national cohesion that they had some years back.
This administration or
Israel
the Israelis themselves?
Israel's a democracy. This administration in Israel is a product of a free election. Mm-hmm. The Israeli people freely voted for this administration, which advocates appeasement.
All right, some would consider it appeasement, and some would consider it peacemaking.
I don't think there's anyone left in Israel who still believes that this has anything to do with peace. There was this delusion of land for peace for 10 years, 30 years actually, going back to the Egyptian peace agreement, in which Israel gave land and got no peace in return. Since the agreement with the Palestinians in Oslo, there have been 2,000 Israelis murdered, and so no one in Israel still believes in peace. What they're now talking about is unilateral disengagement, in which we will give the Arabs land and hopefully they will leave us alone, but that's wishful thinking. There's no thought in Israel that Hamas is a partner for peace.
So what's the alternative? In Devin Sper's government, if you were in charge right now of Israel, you would do what?
First of all, I think the existential threat to Israel is the Palestinian issue. And Israel needs to do three things immediately. She needs to unilaterally declare her border without waiting for permission from an enemy who's not going to agree to that, without waiting for permission from anyone in the world. And then within that border, she needs to declare her sovereignty and enforce it. That means she does not allow terrorist organizations to organize and operate there the way we don't allow Al-Qaeda to operate here. And then thirdly, she needs to defeat and destroy her Palestinian enemies. That's the first step on the road to a different Israel.
Haven't you been trying to do that now for years?
No, if Israel were trying to destroy the Palestinians, they would have been destroyed in one day.
Well, what kind of weaponry would you use? Because, I mean, you already are using planes, you're using tanks, you're using military personnel. Is the only thing left nuclear weaponry?
With the Palestinians, no. They have no tanks, no planes, no artillery. Israel doesn't need nuclear weapons to deal with gangs of Palestinian terrorists.
What do? You
do the same thing we did here to Al-Qaeda. You simply arrest them, wipe them out, do not allow them to operate within your territory. We would not allow cells of Al-Qaeda to operate openly here. We do not allow cells of Al-Qaeda to operate anywhere in the world. The United States has assassinated, according to Donald Rumsfeld, 2,000 to 3,000 leaders without trial of Al-Qaeda all around the world. Israel needs to play by the same rules as every other nation plays, and not allow other nations to hold her to hypocritical double standards.
All right. On the subject of nations, should the Palestinians have one?
As I've said on shows before, yes, that's fine with me, but not on my land, not on our land.
Okay, so you go back, though, to another period of time altogether. You're saying what is known as Palestine now should be Israel?
Israel tried to compromise over her land, and I want to stress her land because it doesn't belong to anyone else and never did. There was never a Palestinian state historically. The fact that they claim it for the future doesn't make it theirs. But the Israelis were willing to compromise for the sake of peace on their land. They found there was no partner on the other side. And it's quite obvious after the election of Hamas that the Palestinian people is very radicalized, is not willing to live at peace with the Israelis. And in that case, since they will not live with you, they're going to have to leave.
Isn't it arguable that there was no such thing as an Israeli land before 1947?
Well, as you know, if you've read the Bible, there certainly was. Jews have lived in Israel for 3,000 years continuously, and they've had sovereignty for 1,300 of those years. They've been the majority for most of that time, and by every criteria, including the criteria of self-defense, the Israelis have the right to that land. If the Palestinians were willing to live peacefully with the Israelis, they also have a claim to the land. I'm not saying that they don't have a claim, a legitimate claim to the land. But when you say that we want to wipe you out, you've now lost your claim to live as my neighbor.
Well, Devin Sper, one of the things that I think is an absolute, unargumentable position is that in 4 minutes, we're probably not going to solve the problems that have gone on now for a couple of thousand years. So let's talk about Iran. What do you do about that?
I don't think Iran is primarily Israel's problem. Iran is much more of an American problem since the United States is a superpower, and Iran threatens the interests of the United States in the Persian Gulf. Just yesterday, they threatened to cut off the oil supplies from the Straits of Hormuz, and they're very capable of doing that. They back Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, all of the Islamic terrorist organizations that are causing murder and mayhem around the world. And so it is incumbent on the United States to deal with that problem.
And if we don't?
If we don't deal with that problem?
If the United States doesn't, if the UN doesn't, if Europe doesn't, if we continue to try to approach this diplomatically, which certainly has been our inclination for the last several years, what does Israel do if, in fact, you say that their will isn't to do really much different than the United States has been doing?
Israel, as I said, can only do one thing: declare a border, which is a defensible border in a very hostile area, not a border the enemy that pleases the enemy, but a border you can defend, which is the Jordan River, and defend herself against great odds as she's done in the past. And hopefully she'll succeed. But the problem is not for Israel if we don't stop Iran. The entire world is under threat by Islamic radicalism. I don't have to tell you, there are bombings in Bali, there are bombings in London, there are bombings in 9/11 here, there have been in Indonesia, in Thailand, in the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. The whole world is dealing with this problem, and it's not primarily an Israeli problem.
The title of your book is The Future of Israel, so in 30 seconds, tell me what you see in 10 years for Israel, the Middle East, and the United States.
There's a difference between what I see and what I would like to see. My book talks about a stronger Israel that will become eventually a major power, because I think it is the only way Israel can survive.
That's what you'd like to see.
That's what I'd like to see. What I see happening is a policy of appeasement, and appeasement history teaches us always leads to self-destruction.
10 years doesn't look too hot, at least as far as the view of Devin Sper. I think that you'd want to see what else he has in store for us and for them and for just about everybody that's affected by anything that goes on in the Middle East. There's numbers, there's a website, this is the book, The Future of Israel. His name is Devin Sper.